So I spend every semester of this class looking forward to the last day of class, the last lecture. And that's, of course, not for the same reason that you're all looking forward to the last day of class. Um, the reason I look forward to it is it gives me an opportunity to step aside just a little bit, step aside from teaching the history of psychology and dealing with all these philosophers and their ideas and all that intellectual history and that sort of thing, and step back and talk a little bit about why you're here, why we're all here at the university and this particular university, and what you need going forward, right? So it really is kind of a last lecture. I try and take a few lectures before the last one and kind of wrap up and make it clear to everybody in the class this is the grand picture of what we were trying to do in class. It's how it all ties together and so on and so forth. And that's a lot easier in person than it has been in video recordings. But anyway, like I said, I spent all semester looking forward to this last lecture. I enjoy it a great deal. I think, at least I hope, students get something important out of it. The problem is that for the past few weeks now, because of this pandemic and everything going online and digital and so on and so forth, I haven't been looking forward to this at all. I'm worried about it, how it's going to play, because it's it's better. I feel better if we're in a class together and we can look each other in the face, and so on and so forth. But I'm going to give it my best shot today, realizing some limitations. But I'm going to give it my best shot to try and convey to you some of the things that I think, in the grand scheme of the whole course, are the most important. And that's because in certain ways they both undergird the course, at least the way I've taught it, but also transcend it. And we're moving outside of just wrapping up the history of psychology. And we're moving now to what's it mean to be at this university? What's it mean to be a Latter-day Saint, a Christian student? That's what I want to talk about, and maybe give you some direction, some encouragement, some exhortations about what's next, and where to go, and how to think about why you're here. Because I think most of the ways that our larger culture and even our Latter-day Saint subculture talk about education and getting an education, so on, are much too narrow, much too small-minded. We have deeper and more important things to think about. And so I want to point you in that direction. And to do that, I want to read to you from a wonderful article that was written by a gentleman I met a few years ago. Stanley Hauerwas is his name. And he's a theologian at Duke Divinity School. But he wrote something absolutely profound, spiritually and intellectually profound. And I want to share it with you, make some comments and contextualize it for you, and so on and so forth. But before I do that, before I jump into that and share some of that with you here, I want to bring up a picture. This is a photograph of one of my sons who served his mission in Mexico City a number of years ago. And I bring this picture up. I have a number of pictures like this from all of my sons who've served missions. I had a son who served in Jamaica, one who served in Thailand, who just came home and is hoping to be reassigned to a new mission to finish out his missionary service. But this was my second son, and he was serving in Mexico City there, and he took a picture with this wonderful family. And I just want you to look at this family. It's a wonderful Latter-day Saint family. there in Mexico City. The young man in the back there with the cap on, he at this time was preparing to serve a mission. He was going to go on a mission. And imagine that he's been and served and returned home by now. But anyway, this family was very, very special to my son, and they were really important to the community and their little ward there in Mexico City. Very faithful group of Latter-day Saints. Now, at this point, you might be saying, well, okay, thanks for the picture. That's sweet. What's that got to do with anything, Dr. Gantt? What's your point? Where are you driving? I'm driving here. If you notice the background of this particular photograph, if you look back there, you'll see a pretty shabby looking building. Plywood, balsa wood, tin. That was their home. That's the home that they lived in. They were a very impoverished family trying to make ends meet. But they were also a deeply faithful and committed family. This is a family that paid their tithing faithfully, gleefully. Now, why am I bringing that up, right? I still haven't answered your question. What's the point of all of this? Well, what I want you to understand is that that family is a family making sacrifices and making offerings to the Lord that we benefit from here at BYU. I'm paid out of tithing funds. I'm a member of the church educational system. My salary comes from the church educational system from tithing funds. Almost none of it comes from your tuition dollars. I want to make sure that everyone understands that while it's a student hobby to complain about tuition costs, the tuition here at BYU is very, very low. It's among the lowest in the world, right? President Hinckley once said, and this has again been a few years ago, but he was very clear that over the course of the 4 years that most undergraduates are at BYU, they will be the beneficiaries, in effect, because of the way in which tithing funds are used to keep tuition costs at such a low level that most of the students here will have benefited over the course of 4 years from somewhere in the neighborhood of an $80,000 scholarship. The equivalent, right? First-rate education, tremendous opportunities, the facilities we have, the technology that we have, first-rate, world-class university, sustained through tithing funds. Tithing funds paid by families from all over the world, offered up freely and cheerfully by families and individuals all over the world, just like this family here, who live in a small, ramshackle home with a dirt floor. And yet they scrape together their widow's mite, as the scriptures speak of it, and they offer it up to the Lord. And some of that finds its way into the classrooms, the technology, the professors' salaries, the staff, and your own Lord tuition. So we're at a very special place. And the reason I share this story is because I don't want anyone to ever forget the obligation that you and I, as faculty and students here at BYU, the obligation we are under to honor and respect those offerings, to be ready to answer to our Lord and Savior about what we did, what use we made of the opportunities that were provided us by these sorts of fellow members of the church, because they need us to be the best that we can be, the most faithful, the hardest working, the most concerned and conscientious. And I think the Lord will ask us for reporting on our stewardship, right? Both as a member of the faculty and as students. What did you do? I believe he will ask us at some point. What did you do with the opportunities that were provided you, right, out of these sacred funds? Did you do just enough to get by? Did you use your 4 years simply as a stepping stone to something else that was really only going to benefit yourself or matter to you, to further career agendas or what have you, to make as much money as possible? Or did you take the opportunity of your time at this special university, funded out of these offerings, these tithes? Did you take that opportunity to learn how to go forth and build the kingdom of God? I believe I believe we'll have to answer that. And it's one of the reasons that in my office on campus, I have, a computer set up, 2 screens. One of those screens almost always has a picture like this, so that every day when I'm writing, researching, prepping for class, leaving for class, returning from class, I have a very powerful visual reminder of what I'm here for and who I will answer to for what I do. And a constant reminder that, it really matters. It matters very deeply that we get it right, that we do it for the right reasons, and that we find a way to magnify our calling as students. Now, I'm going to talk some more about that because that may have struck you as a little odd. But I want to share with you, this article by Stanley Hauerwas, which is also in Learning Suite. You can go and you can read it on your own time there, and you should. But I want to start with this because Hauerwas is going to talk about this idea of being called to be a student. He starts out by saying this: "The Christian religion," wrote Robert Louis Wilken, "is inescapably ritualistic. One is received into the church by a solemn washing with water. Uncompromisingly moral. Be therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect," said Jesus. "And unapologetically intellectual. Be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you," in the words of 1 Peter. Like all the major religions of the world, Christianity is more than a set of devotional practices and a moral code. It is also a way of thinking about God, about human beings, about the world, and history. I'm going to hammer that one home again. I want to make sure you understand that, because sometimes we get caught up in the notion that being a Latter-day Saint, being a Christian, a follower of Christ, is observing a set of do's and don'ts, and thou shalts and thou shalt nots, and attending a certain number of meetings at a certain time. That coming to a religious university means that you take a little time out of your week to go to a devotional on Tuesdays, right, for an hour. But what's being said here, Hauerwas quoting Wilken, is that Christianity is more than that. He says, again, I want to repeat it: like all the major religions of the world, Christianity is more than a set of devotional practices and a moral code. It is also a way of thinking about God, about human beings, about the world and history. Ritualistic, moral, and intellectual, he continues. May these words, ones that Wilkin uses to begin his beautiful book, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, be written on your soul as you begin college and mark your life, characterize and distinguish your life. Right? Hauerwas is writing to young students who are headed off to college, just finished high school, headed off to the university. And you have a little more time under your belt at the university, but I still think what he has to say is absolutely relevant. May these words, ritualistic, moral, and intellectual, be written on your soul as you begin college and mark your life, characterize and distinguish your life for the next 4 years. Be faithful in worship. In America, going to college is one of those heavily mythologized events that everybody tells you will change your life, which is probably at least half true. So don't be foolish and imagine you can take a vacation from church. Be uncompromisingly moral. Undergraduate life on many college campuses tends in the direction of neo-pagan excess. Good kids from good families too often end up using their 4 years at college to get drunk and throw up on one another. Too often they do so on their way to the condom dispensers. What a waste. Not only because such behavior is self-destructive, but also because living this way will prevent you from doing the intellectual work the Christian faith demands. Be deeply intellectual. We, that is the church, need you to do well in school. Now that's different. Usually the way we talk about getting your education, getting your schooling, and reading and studying and taking all these tests is so that you can better yourself for yourself. Get a bigger job, better job, bigger house, bigger car, get ahead in life, all those things. All right. Even here at the BYU, right? We recruit you to come to BYU. We sell in terms of return on investment, ROI. You go and you put your tuition money and your time and your energy into this piggy bank, and what you get out the other end is more lifelong earnings, more career options, right? Now, it's not that that's intrinsically wrong or that we shouldn't be concerned about that. And Hauerwas will have some things to say as we move on here about that. But this is the point that he makes, and it's foundational. We, that is the church. Those folks in Mexico City, the folks who were in Thailand for my other son's mission, the folks who were in Jamaica for yet my other son's mission, right? Those folks here in Utah County, we need you to do well in school. We're relying on you. He'll explain why. He accepts. This may sound strange, because many who represent Christian values seem concerned primarily with how you conduct yourself while you're in college. They do. They're concerned about how you conduct yourself, right? But they relegate the Christian part of being in college to what is done outside the classroom. Right? We can find that even, again, here at BYU, right? Where an awful lot of my colleagues scattered throughout the university are really only concerned about your religious life, your spiritual life, insofar as it takes place outside the classroom, right? And is relegated to other people to worry about. That I teach this, I do this, I teach this class, this is what I do, and we follow the textbook, and this is what I have to give them, and so on and so forth. And in terms of their spiritual maturity and the spiritual strengthening or deepening of their intellectual life, well, they get devotionals on Tuesday, and they have religion classes, and they have family home evening groups, and so on. So it's all outside the classroom. Now, I'm not saying that this is blanket that we're all doing that, but it's easy for that to take place. To think that Christian values are important, but that's something we deal with outside of the classroom, outside of the subject we're teaching here, which is a secular approach, essentially, to a secularly grounded subject matter. That's a problem. And anyway, Hauerwas continues. The Christian fact, he says, is very straightforward. To be a student is a calling. Now, we Latter-day Saints, when we hear the word calling, we think of it just a little differently than maybe Hauerwas does, but not too different. I think we're okay. We hear calling, we think, hands placed on heads, word said, authority, bishops, things like that, right? I was extended a calling, I accepted, I was set apart to do the calling, that sort of thing. Hauerwas doesn't have all of that in there, right? But nonetheless, this idea that, and so we think that way, right? We think, well, being a student isn't a calling. Nobody ever put their hands on my head and set me apart to be a student. I wasn't called. What's Gantt talking about? Right? Well, there's a deeper sense there. The call to Christ, come follow me. Look to me in all your words and deeds to be like me, right? You didn't have to have hands placed on your head to hear that and respond to that calling, to be under obligation to fulfill that calling. And it's that sense in which Hauerwas is talking about this. He's talking about this Christian fact is straightforward. To be a student is a calling. Your parents, he says, your parents are setting up accounts to pay the bills, or you are scraping together your own resources and taking out loans, or a scholarship is making college possible. Whatever the practical source, the end result is the same. You are privileged to enter a time, 4 years, during which your main job is to listen to lectures, attend seminars, go to labs, read books, and talk and think. 4 years, where our culture sits back and says, there you go. You don't have to produce anything. You don't have to have any goods to sell in the marketplace. You don't have to do anything. Go be sequestered in this temple of learning and read and think and study and talk about ideas, write, listen to people who have devoted their lives to particular areas of study. 4 years. You got this. After that, well, then you got to get to work and you're going to get a mortgage and you got bills to pay and you got the IRS is going to be paying attention to you and you got lots of stuff to do. You got to show up and you got to do all the things and do all of that. And there's going to be lots of pressure. But for 4 years, hey, you go be a student. You go read. You go think. You go listen. You go talk about things that matter. And you're not going to have much chance to do that the rest of your life, but here, we want you to go do that. What an amazing thing. And the sad thing for me is that overwhelmingly, most of us, and I was a little bit like this too, when I was a student, I want to get this over with to go on to something else, right? What's the quickest way I can get this done? Right? It's kind of like being a young teenager. I can't wait to be on my own and not being bossed around by my parents and having to live here and follow these rules and all that sort of stuff. We've all been there, right? Then we get out on our own and we're like, oh man, I had it so good. The food was provided, the house was cared for, the laundry was washed. I didn't have to worry about any of that. Wow, what was I thinking? Believe me, this is a wonderful time. Wonderful time. And it may be hard to imagine that coming up on an exam in my class and other classes and all that going on, but what a blessing. It's an extraordinary gift, he says. It is an extraordinary gift in a world of deep injustice and violence, fear and anxiety right now, right? A people exists that thinks some can be given time to study. We need you to take seriously the calling that is yours by virtue of going to college. You may well be thinking, what is he thinking? I'm just beginning my freshman year. I'm not being called to be a student. None of my peers thinks he or she is called to be a student. They're going to college because that prepares you for life. I'm going to college so I can get a better job and have a better life than I'd have if I didn't go to college. That's not a calling. Hauerwas says, but you're a Christian. That makes a big difference. He says, but you are a Christian. This means you cannot go to college just to get a better job. These days, people talk about college as an investment because they think of education as a kind of bank account. You deposit the knowledge and expertise you've earned, and when it comes time to get a job, you make a withdrawal, putting all that stuff on a resume and making money off the investment of your 4 years. Now, Christians need jobs just like everybody else. But the years you spend as an undergraduate are like everything else in your life. They are not yours to do with as you please. They're Christ's. We're his. We covenanted to do his will, to be his disciples. We took upon ourselves his name. And as the New Testament is very clear, he is the author and finisher of our salvation. We are his. He has purchased us with a price, his bloodshed, his atoning sacrifice. Christ's call on you, Hauerwas continues, Christ's call on you as a student is a calling to meet the needs of the church, both for its own life and for the life of the world. The resurrection of Jesus, Wilkins suggests, is not only the central fact of Christian worship, but also the ground of all Christian thinking, quote, about God, about human beings, about the world and history. The resurrection of Jesus is the ground of all Christian thinking about God, about human beings, about the world, about history. Somebody needs to do that thinking, he writes, and that means you. Don't underestimate how much the church needs your mind. Remember your Bible study class? Right now, we don't call it Bible study class. We call it seminary. Christians read Isaiah's prophecy of a suffering servant as pointing to Christ. Now that seems obvious, but it's not. At least it wasn't obvious to the Ethiopian eunuch to whom the Lord sent Philip to explain things. Christ is written everywhere, not only in the prophecies of the Old Testament, but also in the pages of history and in the book of nature. The church has been explaining, interpreting, and illuminating ever since it began. It takes an educated mind to do the church's work of thinking about and interpreting the world in the light of Christ. Physics, sociology, French literary theory, all these and more, in fact, everything you study in college is bathed in the light of Christ. It takes an eye of faith to see that light, and it takes an educated mind to understand and articulate. And we need your mind. We need your mind. There's another dimension to the call of intellectual work. In the first letter of Peter, we read these words, quote, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you. Not everybody believes. In fact, the contemporary American secular university is largely a place of unbelief. And in many ways, contemporary American society is largely a place of unbelief. Thus, the church has a job to do, to explain why belief in the risen Lord makes sense. There's no one formula, no one argument, so don't imagine you will find a magic defense against all objections. You can, however, offer the reasonable defense Peter asks for. you may at least make someone think twice before he rejects the resurrected Christ. Anyway, defense isn't the point. Lots of people feel lost because they imagine being a sophisticated, contemporary intellectual makes faith impossible. The church wants to reach these people. But to do so requires an ambassador at home in the intellectual world. That's you. That's you. That's me. That's us. Or at least that's what you can become if you do your work with enthusiasm. Share in a love of learning. It's a worthy love in its own right, and it will allow you to be the leaven in the lump of academia. So yes, to be a student is to be called to serve the church and the world, to answer for those tithes and offerings of which we are the beneficiaries. Yes, to be a student is to be called to serve the church and the world. But always remember who serves what. Colleges focus on learning. As they do so, they can create the illusion that being smart and well-educated is the be-all and end-all of life. Don't get caught up in that. You do not need to be educated to be a Christian. That's obvious. After all, Christ is most visible to the world in the person who responds to his call, "Come, follow me." Whoever that might be, right? Rich, poor, bond, free, smart, educated, not so educated. Doesn't matter. Come follow me. That's Christ's call. That's Christ at his most visible. Hauerwas continues, I dare say St. Francis of Assisi was more important to the medieval church than any intellectual. One of the most brilliant men in the history of the church, St. Bonaventure, the Franciscan, said as much. But the church needs some Christians to be educated, as St. Bonaventure also knew. This is why he taught at the University of Paris and ensured that in their enthusiasm for the example of St. Francis, his brother Franciscans didn't give up on education. Whatever you end up doing in your life, now is the time when you develop the intellectual skills the church needs for the sake of building up the kingdom of Christ. This is where you begin to develop, to form, to become the kind of person with the kind of abilities and intentions with the basic purpose to bless the church and the world by building up the kingdom of God. In whatever career, whatever position, whatever location you might find yourselves in. Hauerwas continues, your Christian calling as a student does not require you to become a theologian, okay? At least not in the official sense of the word. Speaking as one whose job title is Professor of Theology, I certainly hope you will be attracted to the work of theology. These days, at least in the West, where the dominant intellectual trends have detached themselves from Christianity, the discipline of theology is in a world of hurt, often tempted by silly efforts to dress up the gospel in the latest academic fashions. So God knows we all need all the help we can get. But there's a wider sense of being a theologian, and I think this is the sense, particularly in a religious tradition that looks to apostles more than theologians. It doesn't have paid formal theologians. There's this wider sense of what it means to be a theologian, right? And this is cool stuff here. But there's a wider sense of being a theologian, one that simply means thinking about what you are learning in the light of Christ. This does not happen by making everything fit into church doctrine or biblical preaching. That's theology in the strict official sense. Instead, to become a Christian scholar is more a matter of intention and desire, of bearing witness to Christ in the contemporary world of science, literature, and so forth. And there are lots of ways to do that. You can't do this on your own, though, right? You can't do this on your own. You cannot become a Christian scholar, a Christian psychologist, whatever. You can't become an educated, well-formed Christian thinker by yourself. Can't pull it off by yourself. You need friends. You cannot do this on your own. You'll need friends. Friends who major in physics and biology, as well as in economics, psychology, philosophy, literature, and every other discipline. These friends can be teachers and fellow students. Of course they can. But for the most part, our intellectual friendships are channeled through books. C.S. Lewis has remained popular with Christian students for many good reasons. And you all, I hope, already know, I find C.S. Lewis to be a wonderful, wonderful thinker, a tremendous friend of mine, intellectual friend here. C.S. Lewis has remained popular with Christian students for many good reasons, not the least of which is that he makes himself available to his readers as a trusted friend in Christ. Right? That's true for many other authors also. Get to know them. Books, moreover, Hauerwas continues, are often the way in which our friendships with our fellow students and teachers begin, in which these friendships become cemented. Having something to share, to talk about, ideas. He says, I'm not a big fan of Francis Schaeffer. Now, Francis Schaeffer is an evangelical theologian, right? Hauerwas is Catholic. So you can imagine that they differ on a lot of important theological issues right in their area. I'm not a big fan of Francis Schaeffer, but he can be a point of contact. Something to agree with or to argue about. The same is true for all writers who tackle big questions. Read Plato, read Aristotle, read Hume, John Stuart Mill, and not just because you might learn something. Read them because doing so will provide a sharpness and a depth to your conversations. To a great extent, becoming an educated person means adding lots of layers to your relationships. Layers. Lots of layers. We learned this. Shrek taught us this, right? Ogres have layers. Parfaits have layers. Onions have layers, right? Well, you need to have layers as a Christian, an educated Christian. You have to have layers. To a great extent, becoming an educated person means adding lots of layers to your relationships. Sure, going to the big football game or having a beer or Mountain Dew, as the case may be, with your buddies should be fun on its own terms. But it's also a reality ripe for analysis, discussion, and conversation. If you read Mary Douglas or Claude Lévi-Strauss, you'll have something to say about the rituals of American sports. Maybe something to say about those rituals and their religious overtones. Or you may talk about them in their historical context of the recreation of the Roman arena, right? Anyway. But you'll have something to say. You'll see things in a way that is different, is new, is deeper. And if you read Jane Austen or T.S. Eliot, you'll find you see conversations with friends, particularly while sharing a meal, in entirely new ways. Think of books as the fine threads of a spider's web. They link and connect. We didn't have a standard history of sight textbook as the sole and the sole focus of the course. We read authors, right? Students will send me questions at different times. I get emails, or we talk, before the quarantine times. Students would come and ask me a question about this thinker, this idea, this, that sort of thing. And invariably, I would suggest a book. Right? Oh, and if you really want to, if you really want to get into that and really understand what's going on and how it connects with this and this and this, go read fill in the blank. Right? Books are like that. It's a spider's web. You get in there. They're the links and the connections we make between each other, between people who've lived before, and so anyway. Hauerwas continues on here. This is especially true for your relationships with your teachers. You are not likely to become buddies with your teachers. They tend to be intimidating. Now, this I don't understand at all. I have no idea how anyone, any student could ever view me as intimidating or unapproachable. That just, it baffles me. It happens all the time. I don't get it. But, okay. Okay, so we professors tend to be intimidating. We're also old. Most of us are old and quirky and odd and not very hip. Is that even a word anymore? Anyway, did they use that? Uncool? I don't know. Whatever. They tend to be intimidating, but you can become, Hauerwas says, you can become intellectual friends. And this will most likely happen if you've read some of the same books. You're unlikely to engage a physics professor in an interesting conversation about subatomic particles. As an undergraduate, you don't know enough. But read C.P. Snow's book, The Two Cultures, and I'll bet your physics teacher will want to know what you're thinking. Books are touchstones, common points of reference. They're the water in which our minds swim. You, excuse me, you cannot and should not try to avoid being identified as an intellectual. Now, I confess I'm not altogether happy with the word intellectual as a descriptor for those who are committed to the work of the university. I'm with Hauerwas on this. Sometimes that term intellectual, it gets, as he says, it's often associated with people who betray a kind of self-indulgence. The elite, the arrogance that comes with that. An air that they do not need to justify why they do what they do, because they're intellectuals. They have a different set of rules to play by. Knowledge for knowledge's sake is the dogma used to justify such an understanding of what it means to be an intellectual. But if you're clear about your calling as a student, you can avoid this temptation. You are called to the life of the mind to be of service to the gospel and the church. That's why you're here. That's why you were in my class. That's why I was in my class. That's why this university exists. I am absolutely convinced that, contrary to popular opinion, the university, BYU, does not exist simply to facilitate young men and young women, young Latter-day Saint men, young Latter-day Saint women, facilitate their meeting up and falling in love and getting married and making families. Not that that's not something wondrous and wonderful and certainly part of the Lord's plan, but I don't think that was the primary purpose, the motivating idea, intention of this university, nor is it what carries us through day to day. If that were the sole purpose of this university, well, there are easier ways to do it that cost a lot less, right? We just have more stake dances. There you go, okay? Something else going on here. Something else is going on here. Well, you are called to the life of the mind to be of service to the gospel and the church. Don't resist this calling just because some others misuse it. Fulfilling your calling as a Christian student won't be easy. Okay. my class is hard. I get that, folks. I understand it's hard. But that's because I feel a deep spiritual obligation to you as my students and to my Father in heaven to stretch you, to push you, to pull you, to encourage you, to invite you to get as much as possible, to work and strive as much as possible, because I may only get one chance. I may only be in your orbit for one class your entire life. So make it count. That's what the Lord has let me know. Make it count, right? And here's the thing. I know the class is difficult. I know it demands a lot. I know that there are lots of easier courses, so on and so forth. I get that. And you've put in a lot of work. A lot of work. And at times I guarantee you felt it was unfair. It was too much. Who does this guy think he is? Why? And yet, overwhelmingly, you guys succeed. You meet the challenge. You grow. You learn and you're changed and you have become. My firm belief is that most of my students, and it's not necessarily because of anything I'm doing, it's the experience itself, they leave the class better, deeper, more profound, thoughtful, informed human beings. And that only happens if the expectations are high, right? One of my, take a step away from Hauerwas here for a second. One of my basic philosophical conceits as an educator, as a professor, is this. And it comes from a movie that very few of you have ever seen. It was popular a long time ago. It was called Stand and Deliver. And it's a movie about a teacher in the Los Angeles Unified School District system. His name is Jaime Escalante. And he takes a job as a school teacher. He leaves the aerospace industry where he was an engineer. And he takes a job teaching high school in a very poor and troubled community, I believe in East LA. Right, a lot of minority students, a lot of Hispanic students, a lot of struggles, a lot of crime, a lot of gangs, a lot of poverty and abuse, and it just all of the social ills, right? And it's a real story. I mean, this was a real person, right? It's a wonderful film. Anyway, Jaime Escalante comes in, and he upsets the apple cart. He starts teaching advanced math courses and getting students to take these courses. And his aim is that we're going to prepare these students over a couple of years to take the advanced placement calculus test, because you get college credit for that. And you can do that, and all sorts of schools start wanting you to come. All sorts of colleges start recruiting you, right? And nobody believes. Are you kidding? These kids are barely literate. They have so many troubles and so much they're dealing with in life. And they're, how can you put all of this added stress and pressure on them and make them do this, right? How could you possibly be so heartless to require that? And there's a powerful scene in the film where Jaime Escalante says this in response to these kind of objections and concerns and questions from some of his fellow teachers. And he says, students will rise to the level of expectation. So now you know a little bit about where I've come from this whole semester. I have high expectations, and I love watching you rise to those expectations. To learning, to mastering, to asking questions you otherwise wouldn't, to going back over and over again, and mastering this material and talking about it with each other and getting excited. So we've had high expectations because I think, one, you can always meet them. We have very wonderful students at this university. You're terrific human beings. You're great in a multitude of ways, and you can achieve high expectations. But they're not just my expectations. I believe the Lord demands it of all of us here. He needs sharp weapons to defend, to enlarge, to articulate, to build up the kingdom of heaven, particularly in the world we live in today. Well, Hauerwas has this to say. Fulfilling your calling as a Christian student won't be easy. It's not easy for anyone who is serious about the intellectual life, Christian or not. The curricula of many colleges and universities may seem, and in fact may be, chaotic. I'm proud of BYU, our curricula, our expectations are a little less chaotic than a lot of places. There's still a commitment to general education and a well-rounded student. But that's not the case in a lot of places anymore. Many schools have no particular expectations of the students. You check a few general education boxes, a writing course perhaps, some general distributional requirements, and then you do pretty much as you please. Moreover, there's no guarantee that you'll be encouraged to read. Some classes, even in humanities, are based on textbooks that chop up classic texts into little snippets. You cannot become friends with an author by reading half a dozen pages. Finally, and perhaps worse because insidious, there is a strange anti-intellectualism abroad in academia. Some professors have convinced themselves that all knowledge is just political power dressed up in fancy language, or that books and ideas are simply ideological weapons in the quest for domination. Christians, of all people, recognize that what is known and how it is known produce and reproduce power relations that are unjust. But this does not mean all questions of truth must be abandoned. As I said, it will be easy. You owe it to yourself, Hauerwas says, and to the church not to let the incoherence, the laziness, and the self-critical excesses of contemporary university demoralize you. Be sure not to let these failures become an excuse for you to avoid an education, a Christian education. Although some universities make it quite easy to avoid being well educated, I think you will find that every university or college has teachers who deserve the titles they've been given. Your task is to find them, to find those teachers who are genuinely passionate about their subjects, who seek to make sense of their subjects in light of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ and the resurrection, who challenge their students, who push students, not just professors who are entertaining or easy or look for challenging subjects, challenging professors. The word gets out. Talk to your fellow students. You learn these things. You know. Look at, rate my professor or whatever, right? Go looking for these people. How can you best find these teachers? There are no set principles, Hauerwas says, but I can suggest some guidelines. First, ask around. Are there professors who have reputations as intellectual mentors of Christian students? You're 18. You don't need substitute parents, or at least you don't need parents who think you're still 12. But you do need reliable guides. So rearrange your schedule to take the professor who teaches Dante with sensitivity to the profound theological vision of that great poet. You may end up disagreeing both with the professor and with Dante, but you'll also learn how to think as a Christian. Also, go to the bookstore at the beginning of the term to see which professors assign books, and I mean real books, not just textbooks. Textbooks can play a legitimate role in some disciplines, but not in all, and never at all levels. You want to find the teachers who have intellectual friends, as it were, and who want to share those friends with their students. If a professor has a course outline that gives 2 or 3 weeks to reading St. Augustine's Confessions, you can reasonably hope that he thinks of St. Augustine as someone he knows or wants to know, and as someone he wants to share with students. Your calling is to be a Christian student. The Christian part and the student part are inseparable. It will be hard and frustrating because you won't see how they go together. Nobody does, at least not in the sense of having it all worked out. Nobody sees it at the beginning and having every little detail worked out. But you need to remember what Christ said. I am the Alpha and the Omega. However uncertain we may be about how to be both a Christian and a student, a Christian and a psychologist, we know that being a Christian goes with being a student and a teacher and a professional. Now, eventually you're not going to be an undergraduate or freshman anymore. First-year student, right? And an American undergraduate education will force you to begin to specialize. We start to force you to specialize in the psych major pretty early on. This will present dangers as well as opportunities. Be careful. You will be tempted to choose a major that will give you a sense of coherence. But be careful your major does not narrow you in the wrong way. It's true, for example, that modern psychology provides powerful insights into the human condition. But don't allow your increasing expertise to lure you into illusions of mastery. Continue reading broadly. It may seem that the more you know about less and less, the smarter you've become. After all, you know so much more about psychology. But in truth, the more you know about less and less should teach you humility. After a couple of years spent taking advanced courses in modern European history, you'll know more about the French Revolution. But if you're self-reflective, you'll also know how much work it takes to know anything well. And there's so much more to know about reality than modern European history. I remember a few years back, I got invited, this has been a few, emphasis on the lots. Not just few, I guess. Anyway, I was invited to speak at the year-end banquet for Psy-Chi, which is the Academic Honor Society for psychology majors. And we had a wonderful dinner, and everybody's gathered around. There may be 50 students there. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I got up, and the first thing I said, I need to ask some questions. I need to have some questions answered. How many of you, and so I asked some questions, how many of you have a minor? A few hands went up, several hands went up. How many of you have a double major? A couple fewer hands than the minor, but some hands still went up there. Fascinating. Okay. How many of you have that minor or that major in a discipline outside of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences? One person had their hand up. One person. She was getting a minor in English. And so, well, to be honest, the next thing I said is I looked out over all of them and I shook my family and I said, shame on you, shame on all of you. That's not the kind of thing you want to hear at your year-end banquet at Psy-Chi when you're just going to graduate in a day or two and walk through with the robes and the rest. And here's the speaker. Shame on all of you. You're too narrow. You wasted an opportunity. You didn't study broadly. If your major was psychology and your minor was anthropology, you're still too narrow. We try to fight that with our general education requirements to give you a smattering, but that's still too narrow. That's just not enough. Take this opportunity. Remember the 4 years that our culture, our society has given you and said, hey, just go read and think and talk and learn and be excited about it all. Stretch yourself. Take classes all over the place. Even if it's not your major, it doesn't fulfill a requirement, but that professor is somebody everybody's talking about because he or she has something special, something powerful. Take that opportunity. Now, I understand sometimes financing, it doesn't make it possible. There's other things in the place. It's hard. I get that. But strive to be as broadly educated, as widely read, to make as many friends, intellectual friends, through books, through courses, all sorts of associations. Because we need you to be that kind of person. The church needs you. The Lord needs your mind, and he needs a deep and a wide mind to build up the kingdom of God, to defend, as C.S. Lewis once said, to defend our brethren from the heathen mysticisms of those who deny intellect altogether. Well, to combat a tendency toward the complacency that comes from mastering a discipline, it is particularly important that you gain historical insight into the practice of your discipline. That's what this class has been about. But you're not done just because you did this class. For example, Hauerwas says, I have nothing but high regard for those disciplines we group under the somewhat misleading category, the sciences. Too often, though, students have no idea how and why the scientific field's research agendas developed into their current form of practice. Hopefully you're done with this class. Hopefully you have the first inklings of why we do the things we do, why we research the questions we research, why we use the methods we use, all that. Because now you have some informed imagination, some history, some understanding. Oh, this is why we're doing it. And like I said, but that's just the beginning, folks. Just the beginning. To go back and read Isaac Newton can be a bit of a shock, because he interwove his scientific analysis with his theological arguments. It's all in there, right? All meshed together. Now, you shouldn't take that necessarily as a mandate for doing the same thing in the 21st century. It should, however, make you realize that modern science, psychology, right? Modern psychology has profound metaphysical and theological dimensions that have to be cordoned off. Perhaps for good reasons, or perhaps not. The point is that knowing the history of your discipline will inevitably broaden the kinds of questions you ask and force you to read to be an intellectual rather than just a specialist. Psychology has too many technicians. We have too many people who know how to administer tests, read MRI scans, set up experiments to manipulate certain variables, and haven't the faintest clue what it means to be a human being or how to understand human beings. We have too many technicians who think too narrowly. We don't need more. We need informed imaginations. My class has been an attempt to begin the formation of an informed imagination for you. Hauerwas says, I emphasize broadening your major with historical questions and challenges to set categories because your calling is to be a Christian student, not a physics student or an English student or a psychology student. The Lord didn't call you to be a psychology student. He didn't call me to be a psychology professor. I don't think he's terribly excited about me professing psychology. I didn't covenant to profess psychology. Now, psychology as a discipline, as an intellectual arena of ideas, is a wonderful place for me to witness of Christ in whatever way I can, given a particular audience. And I'm able to witness of Christ to you in the classroom at BYU differently than I would be able to witness of Christ at a professional meeting of the American Psychological Association, presenting a paper to my colleagues there. But the Lord expects me to be ready to do that witness regardless, to find the language, to find the way, to make the world a better place by bringing more and more people to Christ, or at the very least helping them understand what the intellectual issues are. But you're called to be a Christian student who studies psychology or physics or economics or history or whatever it is you're going to study, whatever you're going to become. The Christianity part comes first. Just go back to Mosiah 18 and the baptismal covenant there, to stand as a witness of Christ in all places, in all things, yea, even unto death. Right? There's no qualifiers in that baptismal covenant. It doesn't say, except when you're being a therapist, or except when you're doing scientific research, or except when you're taking this test, or no, it's just to stand as a witness. Now, sometimes that means bearing an explicit, firm testimony. And other times it simply means taking up the right questions and seeking the right kinds of answers, caring about issues that are overlooked. Right? There are lots of ways to bear witness. How do I do that, Dr. Gantt? Well, that's not easy. We just talked about that. It's not easy, but you got to have friends who've been trying, right? You work it out. We go through it. Hauerwas says, again, I do not want to make every Christian in the university into a theologian, but it is important for you to interrogate theologically what you are learning. For example, you may major in economics, a discipline currently dominated by mathematical models and rational choice theories. So is psychology, by the way. Those theories may have some utility, to use an economics expression, but they also may entail anthropological assumptions about the nature of human nature and the purpose of human life. That's what he's talking about. Those theories may have some utility in the discipline, but they may also entail anthropological assumptions that a Christian cannot accept. You will not be in a position even to see the problem, much less address it, if you let your intellectual life be defined entirely by your discipline. Now we're closing, or getting to the end of Hauerwas's points, his argument. Let me return to Robert Wilkins' observation about the ritual, moral, and intellectual life of the Christian. Don't fool yourself. Only a man or a woman who's undergone a long period of spiritual discipline can reliably pray in the solitude of a hermitage. You're young. You need the regular discipline of worship, Bible reading, and Christian fellowship. Don't neglect them in college. Don't go through the motions. Also, don't underestimate the moral temptations of the contemporary college scene, even here at BYU. We cannot help but be influenced by the behavior of our friends. So choose wisely. Your intellectual friends, every bit as much as all your other friends and acquaintances. To worship God, Hauerwas says, and live faithfully are necessary conditions if you are to survive in college. But as a Christian, you are called to do more than just survive. You're called to do more than just the bare minimum to get through it all and move to something else. You're called to do more than that. You are called to use the opportunity you have been given to learn to construe the world as a creature of a God who would have us enjoy and bask in the love that has brought us into existence. That one, I'm going to read that again. That one's deep. That one's powerful. You are called to use the opportunity you have been given to learn to construe the world, to understand the world as a creature of a God who would have us enjoy and bask in the love that has brought us into existence. God has given your mind good work to do. As members of the church, we're counting on you. It won't be easy. It never has been. But I can testify that it can be a source of joy. What a wonderful adventure you have before you. I wish you well. I don't know that I have much more to add to that. I agree with Hauerwas. What a wonderful opportunity. What a wonderful time to be a student, to engage intentionally, forcefully, directly in that wondrous process of becoming a fuller, deeper human being, one whose mind is shaped by and directed towards and filled with the love of Christ, so that all of the rest of the things that that mind can be filled with can make sense, can be filtered, can be sorted, can be understood, and we can then bear intellectual witness, spiritually grounded intellectual witness of Christ in whatever arena, in whatever way. I had a wonderful time with you this semester. It has been heartbreaking that we've had to separate to our own little enclaves and we can't meet on campus together anymore. It was a real joy every Tuesday and Thursday morning to meet with you, to talk about ideas, to agree and disagree and bounce things back and forth and engage in some wonder together. This pandemic will pass and we will have an opportunity to resume life on campus. I hope I get to see you. I hope you send me some emails, send some questions. I'd like to keep the conversation alive as much as possible. Go with God. He's called you to be here. Now go with him. Thank you.